name and spell it.
My name is Jim Connolly, Connolly.
Okay. And let's start with that first part. So this is going to be shot one, take one, and just kind of give me your best, doesn't have to be in those words about the Indy 500 and its tie to BorgWarner.
Every year, millions of people come to Indianapolis or tune in on television to watch the Indy 500. It's one of the most famous automobile races in the world. At the end of the race, the winner hoists the BorgWarner trophy. And that trophy represents a link to Muncie, Indiana, a city about 60 miles to the northeast. Muncie is the home of Warner Gear, one of the main parts of the BorgWarner Corporation. It was a company that started in 1901 and remained a powerful and important presence in the automobile industry through the 20th century. It invented gears, it invented and refined transmissions, and it established itself as one of the key elements in the automobile industry in the United States.
All right. Do you want to cover that? Just say where the trophy came from?
Sure, yeah. The BorgWarner trophy is let me try that again. The BorgWarner trophy is a gift of the BorgWarner Corporation, which has its roots in Muncie, Indiana, a city about 60 miles northeast of the track. Warner Gear started there. It was one of the constituent parts of the BorgWarner Corporation.
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah.
All right, let's start with shot 2A1, and that's going to be, tell me where is Muncie, what kind of town it is, small industrial town located in the Midwest, I don't know anything about it.
Okay. Muncie is a factory town located about 60 miles northeast of Indianapolis in what's called East Central Indiana. It's a town that started as a result of the discovery of natural gas in eastern Indiana in the late 19th century. The gas boom, as they called it, really created Muncie. Before that, it was a sleepy county seat, about 5,000 people. But with the discovery of gas in the 1880s, it quickly became a boom town, a bustling industrial city, and it remained that way, and it became a center of automobile manufacturing, or automobile parts manufacturing in the 20th century.
Call out with shots. Okay, so let's continue on with the gas boom.
The gas boom started in the 1880s when natural gas was discovered in a town just north of Muncie. And Muncie was perfectly situated to take advantage of this resource. It was essentially free fuel for anyone who wanted to come and set up a business there. And businessmen in Muncie worked very hard to attract business. They advertised the city. It got a national reputation as a boom town. And perhaps the most famous company to be drawn to Muncie by natural gas was the Ball Corporation. It was run by 5 brothers from Buffalo, New York, who wanted to relocate their glass blowing company to a place in this gas belt, in this area that was created by the discovery of natural gas. Muncie offered them $5,000 free land and free gas if they would come and set up their factory in Muncie. And so they did. They came to Muncie in 1886. Their business took off. It was an enormous advantage to have free fuel, and the Ball Corporation became an important company in the city and really one of the most prosperous companies in the country by the end of the 19th century. And Muncie did this for a lot of other businesses. They started luring businesses here in the 1880s and 1890s at a really rapid pace. By the end of the 1890s, there were 7 glass companies. There were, I think, 14 iron and steel foundries. There was a washing machine company. There was a paper mill. There was steel and wire companies. It was an industrial city. It had gone from a sleepy town to an industrial city almost overnight.
Let's talk a little bit about the lens, and talk in the way of how did this landscape change with this industry as far as the people. You gave good details about the players in the game.
Okay.
The effects on the people, stuff like that. That's where the video of the man haters and the people on the street. We're gonna be seeing this as you're talking. So go ahead.
So the gas boom really jump-started the growth of Muncie. The population doubled in the 1880s. It doubled again in the 1890s. And there was an expectation that it would keep growing at that rate through the 20th century. That expectation didn't hold because the natural gas ran out. It was really a case of wasting natural resources, burning natural gas all over the place all the time. People were digging holes in their backyard and setting up wells and running the gas directly into their house to burn lights. Street lights were simply gas flambeaux that burned constantly. And so the gas ran out by about 1902, but what the gas boom had done is give the city really a jump start towards industrialization. And so while some plants left once there was no cheap fuel available, many others, like the Ball Corporation, stuck around. They'd invested too much money, too much time and energy into their plants, and it was easier and made more sense to convert over to coal-powered fuel. And so the Ball Corporation remained, Indiana Steel and Wire remained, the Whiteley Foundry remained. A lot of these businesses stayed in town, and Muncie was now an industrial city. This meant there was a growing population, not growing spectacularly, but growing steadily, so that by the time you got to the 1920s, Muncie was a factory town of about 35,000 people.
Good, that was really good. That gives me a lot of good detail and stuff like that. So, you want to move into the lens now? I mean, or is there some other points you have?
Well, how do you want to do it? You want to do this? I mean, we'll come back to sort of the prosperous middle 20th century Muncie.
Yeah.
But want to do the lens first?
That was about the same time frame, right?
20s is when they come.
20s, and
yeah.
we can come back to the prosperity of the 40s, 50s, and 60s.
Yeah, I think that probably makes sense.
Okay.
So, okay.
This is still shot too.
Muncie is famous as Middletown. It was the subject of a sociological study completed by Robert and Helen Lind during the 1920s. The Linds came to Muncie to study the impact of industrialization, and particularly to study the relationship between the classes, between what they called the working class and the business class. We would call it the middle class. And so they arrived in the 1920s and studied every facet of the community's life: religious life, civic life, home life, education, work, and so forth. And they produced this incredibly detailed study, which they called Middletown, which they published in 1929. And the book was an enormous success. It was a bestseller, it was widely read, it was widely reviewed and widely praised. In fact, it's remained in print ever since and is considered a classic sociological study. The Linds came back and did it again in the 1930s. They studied this impact of the Great Depression on the city in the 1930s. And other scholars have come since, and they've kept coming to Muncie to replicate what the Linds did, to see how the city's changed and how it hasn't changed over the course of the 20th century. So there's an enormous body of research on the city. On a per capita basis, Muncie is probably the most studied city in the United States. What else? What did I leave out? So.
You know what? It was a good introduction of them and stuff. And
Yep.
Let's talk a little bit about the why. Who hired? It was the Rockefellers.
Okay, you want to go that? All right.
Yeah, we can, I mean, I don't know if we'll use it, but
Okay.
We'll go into why the Rockefellers with Cripple Creek, and give a little bit of backstory. You're kind of the person that can give this backstory.
Okay, I didn't know if you wanted that much.
Yeah, sure.
That much detail. The Linds were commissioned to do the study that became Middletown by an organization called the Institute for Social and Religious Research, which was an offshoot of the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller family was particularly anxious to understand class relations in the city. They owned mines, they owned a lot of different businesses, and they were quite worried that the United States in the early 20th century was on the verge of a social cataclysm, a revolution. And so they wanted to figure out ways to improve the relationship between the working class and the middle class. And the Rockefellers were also devout Baptists. They were deeply religious. And so John D. Rockefeller Jr. in particular believed that religious institutions and religious life was the way to solve class problems, social problems. And so the original idea behind this small city study, as they called it, was to go in and to study how religious institutions dealt with social problems, how religious institutions could be used to reduce class tensions, reduce class conflict. But what the Linds ended up doing was something altogether different. They completed what they called a total situation study. They studied every facet of the community's life. They looked at religion, yes, but they also looked at work life, at education, at leisure, civics, and so forth. And so when they finished the book, the study, and they handed in the manuscript to the Institute, the directors of the Institute looked at it and said, well, what's this? This is not anything like what we commissioned for you to do. And they said to the Linds, we don't want it, you can do whatever you want with it. And so they approached a series of publishers, found a publisher to put the book out in 1929 finally. And as it was an enormous success. It was a bestseller, it was widely reviewed and praised, it was really the talk of the country for a couple of years after it first came out. So.
Okay.
I forgot about Cripple Creek. You want me to talk about that?
No, that's fine. You mentioned the Rockefellers. I mean, we can touch on it. You know, what would you say their motivation was because of what happened there?
That was part of it. I mean, that was the events that led up to it. So.
Okay. I mean, we can certainly do a line on that.
Well, the Rockefellers were worried about class conflict because of violent labor clashes in Colorado at Cripple Creek and in other places that made them particularly concerned that the United States was going to face some kind of revolution, some kind of Marxist revolt or other kind of cataclysm. Is that sort of the city became this sort of emblem of industrialization. This was the sort of the understanding Muncie meant understanding industrialization in a microcosm at the ground level. So everybody knows about Muncie, whether they know it or not, because the findings of Middletown crept into social studies textbooks, crept into college history textbooks, and so forth. And so the city really has become a laboratory for understanding industrialization, its impact on people's lives, daily lives, work lives, community life, and so forth. What the Linds found was a place that really hadn't changed much in a cultural sense, even though it had changed a lot in an economic sense. It had transformed itself from a sleepy county seat to a busy industrial city, but people still kind of saw the world in the same terms. They were still very conservative, they were still very religious, there was a great emphasis on individualism, there was an expectation that people pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps. So it was a pretty conservative place. And the Linds were a little puzzled by this. They expected a little more unease, a little more tension. And while they found the community divided, they were surprised that there wasn't more conflict. And scholars that have come back since, the Linds themselves in the 1930s and other people who've come back over the course of the 20th century found pretty much the same thing, that the city hasn't changed. It's had its ups and its downs economically, but in a cultural sense, in terms of values and priorities, it hasn't changed nearly as much as one might expect.
Great. You ready to move into the Warner's history?
Yeah, sure. You ready?
Yeah.
Well, you could say that Warner Gear started in a bedroom. There were two brothers who'd come to Muncie in the early 20th century, Tom and Hugh. And Hugh was a tinkerer, he was an inventor. He'd already invented a couple of devices for telephones, and he'd come to Muncie to work for an electrical company. In his spare time, he tinkered with gears and other parts for this new invention, the automobile. And working in his bedroom, he came up with two inventions. One was a differential gear, which was a device that allowed wheels on the same axle to turn at different rates. And you need that to make cars more maneuverable. And he also invented an improved transmission, a sliding gear transmission. And these two inventions became the basis for what would become Warner Gear. The Warners teamed up with a group of investors in town, headed by Abbott Johnson, a lumberman who'd made a good amount of money, not only in lumber, but in a couple of other businesses. And he was a man on the make. He was looking for new investment opportunities. So he formed a partnership with the Warners, Tom and Hugh particularly, and began to market these inventions that Hugh had been coming up with. Ray Johnson, Abbott's son, took Hugh's differential gear to a New York auto show in 1903, and he had it on display, and an older gentleman came up to the display and started talking to him about what it was and asking him some questions about it. And then this man asked Ray, how many can you make for me? And Ray said, as many as you'd like. And the man replied, I'd like 4,000 immediately. And the story goes that Ray supposedly fell off his chair at that. It turned out that this older man was Ransom Olds, the inventor of the Oldsmobile. And Warner Gear had gotten its first contract for differential gears with the Oldsmobile company. The next year, the Hudson Auto Company also signed a $175,000 deal with Warner Gear for the sliding gear transmissions. And so between these two inventions, Warner Gear just took off. It went from a small operation, basically Hugh and Tom and a few people working in a barn with a dirt floor, to within a few years, a place housed in a large factory employing 225 people. And the company continued to grow through the teens and 20s as the automobile industry grew. It became a supplier to Ford, it became a supplier to other automobile companies. And by the beginning of World War I, about 1917, it had more than 2,000 employees working in a new large factory just on the edge of Muncie's downtown. So Warner Gear was in many ways a product of both entrepreneurialism and innovation. You had an inventor, Hugh, who put things together. You had money men headed by Abbott Johnson, who really supplied the capital you needed for this company to get going. And it was really part of almost a business frenzy in Muncie in the early 20th century. You had people coming into town because of the gas boom to start up companies of all sorts. And so a man like Abbott Johnson was really looking out for the main chance, for an opportunity to really develop a successful company. And with these inventions that Hugh had come up with, he was able to do that. He was able to turn Warner Gear into really a powerhouse in the auto parts industry quite quickly.
Do you want to talk about the balls?
Well, let's do the. By the end of the first decade of the 20th century, the Warners and the investors led by Abbott Johnson had a falling out. The Warners went their separate way, started other companies. Tom Warner went on to work for GM in a prominent role. Meanwhile, the Abbotts brought in new investors. Most significantly, they brought in the Ball family, who put new capital, new money into the company, and it expanded quite rapidly. The Balls not only owned the Ball Glass Corporation, they also owned an automobile company, and so they were able to use Warner Gear parts in the automobiles that they manufactured. And so the company really was thriving. It was a very large company by the end of by World War I. So that wasn't very good. The next step in terms of the evolution of Warner Gear was a decision that they took in 1920 to start standardizing the transmissions they made. They, instead of producing a transmission for every different car company that was made to the specifications of that company, they said to all these companies, we're going to make one kind of transmission, we're going to design it and so that it fits every car, and that you need to design your cars so that it fits our transmissions. And they succeeded in doing this, and this made Warner Gear a lot more efficient. It made it much more profitable, and so it continued to grow through the 1920s. By the end of the 1920s, it had nearly 3,000 people working for it. It had set up 2 large factories in Muncie, and it was a really prosperous company. Is that working?
Yeah.
So. In 1928, Warner Gear merged with Borg and Beck and some other companies to create the corporation BorgWarner. In the short term, this didn't mean a whole lot for people living in Muncie or for people working at Warner Gear. Warner Gear was still pretty much an independent operation. It was part of a larger corporation now, but it ran its own shop. It had its own research and development wing. It was essentially its own company. It wasn't just an assembly plant that was managed elsewhere. It was a company that still came up with its own products, marketed its own products, worked independently of the rest of the corporation. But the merger with Borg and Beck and with these other companies was really the first step in the loss of local control over Warner Gear.
Let's talk a little bit about that. You know, that's significant. That's a pretty big point in history here. Muncie and
Right.
Warner. So, you know, this loss of control and this first step in.
There's the dog. Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
In this, I guess you could say the very beginning of globalization, but more of nationalization, I guess, what was going on.
Yeah, or consolidation.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So,
you know, this had to kind of, let's talk about it in a way that maybe it could have affected people, you know, and the players, you know, changed because it now was being controlled by a big board and stuff like that.
So
The local business players.
yeah, although that doesn't really happen for quite a while because
They left it alone.
well, Warner Gear is the really, in many ways, the engine of the BorgWarner Corporation for a long time. And so the people who ran Warner Gear really had exerted a lot of influence over how BorgWarner was run. And the Balls in particular were directors of the corporation and had a significant influence over the decision-making process. But still, gradually what happens is that other units, other parts of the BorgWarner Corporation become more prominent. Other people get involved in the management of the company. And eventually, in the long run, this means that the fate of Warner Gear is in the hands of people in other parts of the country and even other parts of the world.
Good. Nice. Yeah, I didn't know the difference, but you explained it right there.
Yeah.
So, okay.
So by the middle of the 20th century, Muncie was a prosperous, even vibrant place. It was growing steadily, if not spectacularly. Its population crept up all the way up close to 80,000 people by the early 1970s. It was a factory town. There were lots of factory jobs. If you go and you talk to the workers from the period, they tell you things like there was a job in every corner. And you hear stories about how you could, if you didn't like your job, you could walk out of one place and you could go down the street to another place and get a job in a day. So it was a place that there was plenty of opportunities for people. You didn't need a great deal of education or training. You could walk right out of high school one day and right into the factory floor the next day in many places. So it was a place that was prosperous and vibrant. The city was doing well. It had all kinds of businesses, all kinds of activity. In the mid-1940s, right after World War II, there were at least a dozen large factories in the city, employing hundreds of people, if not thousands in some cases. There was the Indiana Bridge Company, Indiana Steel and Wire, Muncie Malleable, a foundry. There was a meatpacking plant. There were two large auto parts plants. One was a plant run by Chevrolet, and the second plant was Warner Gear. And each of those plants employed thousands of people. And the wages by this time were pretty good. These were unionized jobs. They paid fairly well. And so people in Muncie were prosperous and the community was prosperous.
Okay. Talk a little bit about, I know you mentioned some of the factories.
Mm-hmm.
You know, let's talk a little bit about the culture and the quality of life, you know.
Mm-hmm.
'Cause I don't want to get into union stuff yet because that's coming next, but we'll talk a little bit about how, you know, this was the good times, the heydays where people could have what other people had, you know, as far as between worker and management, but just, we won't.
Not the union part of it.
Yeah, don't separate it that way, but just this quality of life kind of,
Mm-hmm.
that was good with, you know, everybody could take vacations or, you know.
Yeah, although a lot of that really is, we might want to save that for unions because that's vacations, you know, the middle class wages. Those are the products of the union, as well as this. It's both, but the union is a sort of a necessary component. Yeah, exactly.
We're going to start off talking about, you know, the struggles of forming the unions and how the Balls
Right.
were very much against it. All these companies were against it. What was, you know, the environment these guys worked in, you know, before unions.
Right.
So, and that's where we can show this gritty footage of the fires and the industry and all that. So, okay, go ahead.
Okay. When the Linds came to Muncie, one of the things they were puzzled by was the absence of any unions, or there's very little unionization. In the 1890s, there had been a fairly active union movement in Muncie, but by the 1920s, it was pretty much gone. There were company unions run by the businesses themselves, but they were really controlled by the businesses. They weren't controlled by the workers. And so the Linds were a little surprised because life in many ways had gotten more difficult for workers. The jobs on factory floors were boring, they were routine, they were repetitive, the working conditions were difficult, they were dirty, they were sometimes poorly lit, there were real health hazards. And these jobs in factories were also really insecure. One of the things that was quite common in the early 20th century was for workers to be laid off during slack season. If business got slow, you were let go. And there was no guarantee that you'd be brought on again when business picked up. You might be, but you might not be. And this was particularly a concern for older workers who were liable to be let go and then not rehired because the company could hire, perhaps more cheaply, a younger person who could work more quickly. And so this concern for security was particularly acute for workers in the 19-teens and 1920s. And so it was a bit of a surprise when the Linds came to Muncie and found that these workers weren't more up in arms, that they weren't more ready to form unions and demand better security. And there were a lot of reasons for that. Certainly one of the reasons was that employers in the city were reluctant to see unions formed and really resistant to the idea of unions. The Ball family and other business leaders really worked in a number of different ways to try and keep unions out of the city. One of the things they did was they tended to recruit workers when they were hiring from the South. They would go down to Tennessee and Kentucky and try to recruit workers from those areas. Partly, I think, on the theory that workers from the South were less likely to want to form unions than were immigrants or people from the Northeast, where unions were stronger and the union movement was more popular. And so this, I think, shaped the character of the community and of the workforce. The Balls and others pressured local newspapers not to put advertisements in the paper for jobs in other communities because they didn't want to risk losing their workers. They wanted to keep a kind of captive workforce. And on the shop floor, they did form employee associations, basically company unions, that would try to address some of the complaints of workers. They had picnics, they organized sports teams, they had entertainment, all of which was trying to cement the loyalty of workers. But when business got bad, they didn't hesitate to let them go, and there was no guarantee, as I said, that they would be brought back again at another time. And so this question of security was really on the minds of workers. Add to that the tediousness, the repetitiveness of factory work, the difficult working conditions, and then on top of that, in the 1930s, the Great Depression, and discontent did begin to sort of percolate amongst workers, and the demand for unions increases in the 1930s. Now, the thing that made unions ultimately possible was the Wagner Act, a part of the New Deal, a law that made the federal government responsible for helping unions organize, or at least creating the process by which unions could organize without any intimidation from employers. And so this meant that workers in Warner Gear were able to organize a union in 1937. They became Local 287 of the United Auto Workers, the UAW. And 287 has been the local for Warner Gear workers ever since, all the way into the 21st century. So.
Okay. On that subject?
The formation of Local 287 gave Warner Gear workers a couple of things they really wanted. First of all, it gave them seniority rights. It didn't mean you were never going to be laid off again, but it meant that if the company started rehiring, they would rehire the longest standing employees first. So you didn't risk losing your job when you got to be 50 years old in the same way that you had been before. So that sense of security was really important for Warner Gear workers. They got a 10% pay hike, they got overtime pay, so they got some other things as well, but really, as much as anything, it was that sense of security that unions provided. Now, the formation of a union for Warner Gear didn't solve all the workers' problems, and there continued to be conflicts. The first contract was up after 2 years in 1939, and there was a strike. And this became kind of the rhythm of work life at Warner Gear. You'd sign a contract, you'd fill the contract, and then there'd be a strike before the next contract was signed. So there was a strike in 1943. There was another strike in 1944, in 45, in 46. It was not quite an annual event, but it was a pretty regular event. And this continued into the 1950s. There were large strikes in 1950 and in 1953. And this is a large part of the reason why Muncie got a reputation as a tough union town, as a place where workers were ready to strike. The other thing was Local 287 was not part of a larger bargaining union with the whole BorgWarner Corporation. It wasn't connected to the UAW unions in the other parts of the corporation. And so it operated on its own terms. And it would go on strike even when the UAW headquarters didn't necessarily want the local to go on strike. And so there was a fair amount of tension, conflict, a good amount of distrust that built up between the union and the company over the years. And that distrust lingered into the later part of the 20th century when circumstances changed.
Right. Ready?
Yeah.
So.
The formation of a union made it possible for Warner Gear workers to join the middle class. It gave them the pay and the security to be able to afford a house, a car, maybe even a second car, to go on a vacation, to send a kid to college even. And so through the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a certain amount of friction between the company and the union. But from the point of view of the workers, things were pretty good. A Warner Gear job was about as good as it got in Muncie. You got good pay, you got good benefits. You really did quite well. There wasn't a job in the city that most people would have preferred. And in many ways, you were members of an elite if you got a job at Warner Gear. And that was really because unions sort of guaranteed the security, the financial security of these workers. Now, there were other benefits to unions too. The unions created a social world, a social network for these people to operate in, bowling leagues, basketball teams, picnics, and other social events. It really created a network. It gave you a sort of connection to the levers of power in the city. You became part of a group that really had an influence over how the community worked. In 1967, a UAW-287 member was elected mayor of the city, Paul Cooley. And so you had a certain amount of clout if you were a member of the Warner Gear local or a member of any union in the city. One of my favorite stories about how unions really were able to influence life came when a group of waitresses who were working at the Hotel Roberts, a downtown hotel, went on strike. They weren't organized. They were paid very poorly. This was in the early 60s. And so they tried to go on strike for better wages. And in support of that, the UAW locals and some of the other unions in town picketed the hotel. And the local police, acting sort of under the influence or at the advice of the Chamber of Commerce, which was resistant to the strike and to the waitresses, the local police came down and tried to break up the pickets, and there was a clash, and a bunch of the union guys got thrown in jail. And so one of the union leaders called up the mayor, who at the time was in Washington, D.C. at a meeting of a national meeting for mayors. And it basically summoned him back to the city and arranged for the policemen to be reprimanded, and of course for all the union guys to get out of jail. And eventually these waitresses won a deal, became organized, got better wages, better benefits. So the UAW was in a position to help other people. It was in a position to tell elected officials what to do, to come back to Washington at the drop of a hat. And so it was that kind of power, that sense of control over your life that a union gave you. You knew that if you had a problem, whether it was a personal problem or a political problem, you had access to the people in charge of the community, and you could make things better for yourself. You could make things happen. So it was this kind of control, this sense of influence over your life that really is part of what unions provided for workers. And it's what's being lost now as the economy changes. Workers today don't have that same sense of control over their lives.
Yeah. That's an interesting story. I never heard that.
Yeah, it was. I remember that actually the other day. No, actually, we did it. In the interviews that Warren and I did years ago. That was one of the stories. That was one of my favorites, and I'd forgotten about that.
Okay. Yeah.
So,
Can hit on that.
another way that the Warner Gear local had an impact on the community that went beyond their one company was in really setting the wage rates for the workers in the city. Other unions, other sets of workers would look to 287's bargains, its deals, as the sort of the prevailing wage for the community. So when, for instance, in the 1970s, workers at a Westinghouse plant went on strike, they demanded wages equal to what the people over at the Warner Gear shop were getting. And so the rise of the UAW in Muncie meant not just better wages and better benefits for auto parts workers, it also meant better benefits for people working in other businesses and other plants. It set a kind of prevailing level of wages for really the entire community, or at least for all the people working in factories in the city. So that was another way that the unions benefited the community. They provided this sort of network of people. The unions were heavily involved, for instance, in the United Way. And they were heavily involved in local politics. They were heavily involved in a variety of civic activities, charitable activities, that really influenced the community and really benefited the community. And when you talk to the people who were involved in the union movement at Warner Gear and at other places around the town, all of them point to this, that it wasn't just about getting better wages and it wasn't just about getting more benefits, it was also about getting or helping the community in a variety of ways. And so there was a real sense of pride belonging to these institutions and a real strong belief on the part of their members that they had helped the community in all kinds of ways.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit, you did talk about the bowling leagues and stuff like that. Let's have you go in maybe a little bit more on the culture and the Christmas parties and you know, what this did for the identity of the people,
Right.
their psyche and their children. I mean, this whole way of life, Norman Rockwell will kind of label it for now, what's kind of came out of this.
Okay.
And whenever you're ready.
Unions also provided really a way of life for their members. You went to the local Christmas parties. You went to the local picnics on holidays like the 4th of July and Labor Day. You played in the locals' basketball teams. You were in the union bowling leagues. You were attending all kinds of events and social activities about unions. So if you were a kid growing up in a union household, the union, the local, was an enormous part of your life. It was how you knew people. It was in many ways, you know, a big part of the social network that you belonged in. And it gave you a sense of belonging to a particular segment of the community, a sense of connection to that community and control over your life that was really valuable. So that it was more than just the material benefits that made unions important to workers, but also these kinds of social and civic benefits. Does that work? I mean, I don't have a lot of details, specifics, but just...
No, that's fine. You know, I want to kind of talk about, you know, play psychologist a little bit, you know.
Well, that's what I mean by the control. I mean, what else do you have in mind there?
I mean, there's the control, but there's the
Belonging.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is, if we're looking at the problems that are going on now, they're a root of what I said in that email. You know, there were such good times, and people thought for generations, I'm just going to come up to this.
Okay, create a mentality. I see what you're saying.
kind of create that mentality that is later not going to be there, and it's going to be taken away. So it kind of, what I want to say, it's kind of like somebody getting on welfare in a sense. We use that.
I'm probably not going to say that, but
no,
I know what you mean.
But I mean that kind of equation to say that they're there and that's how things, you know, don't get out of that cycle.
Right.
So let's see how you can put that kind of, you know, the families, you know, and the community these guys had kind of perpetuated this idea onto for generations that these jobs would be here, this way of life would be here, and it was very solid bedrock for them.
Yeah.
So I kind of want to read that somehow your way.
Let me think about that for a second. So.
Yeah. Hold on one second. Hold that thought. Okay, go ahead.
In some ways, you might argue unions were almost too successful for their own good. People who were raised in union families came to expect that when their time came, when they had finished high school, there'd be a job waiting for them at Warner Gear or at another plant, that they could put in their 30 years and then retire at a relatively young age, and in the meantime make very good wages. And there was a sense that this kind of set of opportunities was going to remain in place forever, that this was the way things were going to work. And so when things began to change, when things became more difficult, when resources became scarcer, when companies were facing new kinds of competition, and these opportunities disappear, it was hard for union workers to imagine a different life, a different set of opportunities. They had become so enmeshed in this world of not only sort of unions and contracts and bargaining, but also picnics and parties and sports leagues and so forth, that it was their world, it was their way of life, and it was almost impossible for them to imagine another kind of world, another set of circumstances, where the expectations would be different, where the bargain would be different.
Okay. Would you say, you know, that idea that was perpetuated onto their children and their
Mhm.
grandchildren, was something that was maybe kind of false, or what I'm trying to allude to is that there was this kind of false identity that was
Mhm.
placed in.
I don't think it was false. I think it's a pretty normal thing.
Yeah.
The sense of security was so strong that it made it possible for people to simply assume the world would work the same way in the next generation and the generation after that. And so in some ways that sense of security was false because it was not quite fleeting, but it was temporary. It wasn't a permanent set of circumstances. There were a particular set of historical circumstances that made it possible for union-based companies in places like Muncie, Indiana, to be profitable. But those circumstances eventually were going to change. And when those changed, workers had to change too. But they were so accustomed to sort of the secure kind of life that they had gained through unions, through these prosperous companies, that they weren't really ready to change when the time came. It was very difficult for them to change. It still is. It's still something that, in many cases, they probably have had a hard time coming to grips with.
Okay, good. That gets really close to it. I think it's still something that's hard to come out.
Well, I'm reluctant to sort of be too much the psychologist. I'd rather we find passages where the people themselves either say it directly or say it in a way that illustrates that point. Yeah. I mean, I'll say, if you want me to say it, I'll say some more, but.
No. I mean, we can get into that when we talk about the downfall.
Yeah, that'll come back, yeah. From the point of view of a Warner Gear worker and local 287 member in the middle part of the 20th century, the world was a pretty good place. You had to fight for your wages and your benefits, but you won a fair amount of those fights. You did pretty well. You were doing well in an economic sense, in a financial sense. You had a pretty good life. But that world changed, and it changed because of things that were happening in other parts of the world. After World War II, the United States was in a really strong place in an economic sense. Europe had been destroyed. Asia was weakened. Really, the United States was the only country that had the economic power to really manufacture things and compete on a global scale. And so for the 40s, for the 50s, into the 1960s, the United States was an extraordinarily prosperous place. But eventually those circumstances changed. And the economy globalized. And that was certainly true of the automobile business and the auto parts business. In the 1950s, the place that made the best cars was the United States. But by the 1980s and 1990s, competition from companies based in Japan, companies based in other parts of the world, or companies operating in other parts of the world grew more intense. And this cut both ways. Companies like BorgWarner started to set up shop in other parts of the world. As early as the 1960s, BorgWarner was operating overseas in Europe. By the 1980s and 1990s, it had plants.
Kind of come in a little more and have you start that over.
From where?
By the 1960s, BorgWarner had started
Right.
to kind of move
Okay.
and globalize.
Tell me when you're ready.
Okay, go ahead.
As early as the 1960s, BorgWarner was setting up operations in Europe. By the time you get to the 1980s and 1990s, it's opening factories in not only places like Italy and Germany, but Japan and China. And so it was becoming really a global corporation. One of the things I thought was most striking was when the company struck a deal with a Chinese transmission maker, and the new company, which started in 1992, was called Beijing Warner Gear. And this just sort of tells you what's happening. The original Warner Gear starts in Muncie, but by at the beginning of the 20th century, by the end of the 20th century, you've got Beijing Warner Gear setting up shop halfway around the world. And that really sort of captures the transformation of the automobile business, both cars and parts. They're being made all over the world. And this worked both ways. At the same time as American companies like BorgWarner were setting up shop overseas, companies from other parts of the world, particularly Japan, were setting up shop in the United States. So Toyota and Honda were opening plants in the United States. And the plants that they opened were non-unionized, which meant they paid less. The overall labor costs were lower than they were for the big three automakers based in the United States. And so it became harder and harder for places like Ford and Chevrolet, GM, to compete with Honda and Toyota. To do that, they had to reduce costs in all sorts of ways. One of the ways that they worked to reduce costs was to bring the making of things like transmissions in-house. So instead of contracting with a company like BorgWarner for transmissions, Ford would make its own transmissions. And that meant less work, less opportunities for people on the shop floor at Warner Gear. And so what you start to see is the Warner Gear operation, which was an expensive one because it was a unionized plant, gradually phased down. And so from a peak of more than 5,000, nearly 6,000 people in the 1950s, the company gradually shrank down. It had its ups and downs, but it gradually shrank down to employing fewer than 1,000 people by the end of the 20th century. By the 60s and 70s, there was really a subtle change in the way unions bargained. The concerns in the early years of a union like Local 287 were for better wages and for seniority rights and for things like overtime pay. But eventually they get to the point where the wage rates are pretty good. And so increasingly the strategy becomes to forego further wage increases and to get more in the way of benefits, and particularly to get more in the way of health and retirement benefits. Healthcare costs are starting to creep up in the 70s and 80s. And people who are retiring from Warner Gear after 30 years, if they started at 18, they're retiring before they're even 50 years old. And so they want a good set of benefits to carry them forward through their 50s and 60s. And so what the union does in the case of Local 287 and Warner Gear is they say, well, we'll take a little less pay for a little more in the way of benefits. And at the time, that made sense for the company, but over time, that became a problem. As more and more retirees were living to older ages, the expenses of paying retiree benefits, and especially the expenses of paying health care benefits, became enormous. And so when you got to the 1990s and the early 2000s, all of a sudden these companies, and it's not just BorgWarner, but other places, are paying as much or even perhaps more in terms of retirement and health benefits to people who aren't working in the plant anymore as they are paying in wages to the people who are on the shop floor. And so this becomes an unsustainable arrangement. The companies simply can't afford to do this and to compete against the non-union plants run by Honda and Toyota, to compete against companies that are operating overseas under different sets of labor arrangements. So the structural costs of maintaining these kinds of unionized plants becomes more and more difficult. Warner Gear actually manages to hang on pretty well. It continues to innovate. It's very aggressive in its sales efforts, and so it gets some new lines. And so the company remains active for a good while. But the company itself is also changing. Through the 1970s, it has its own R&D operation. It's developing its own products. But eventually that function is consolidated at the headquarters of BorgWarner. And what you get is really just an assembly plant. It used to be a company of its own, but by the 1990s, Warner Gear is just an assembly plant. All the research, all the product development, all those kinds of things are taking place elsewhere in other parts of BorgWarner. And so it becomes less and less viable. It becomes an extraordinarily expensive assembly plant, one that has to pay not only union level wages, but also has to pay for the retirement benefits for a large and growing number of people who've retired from the plant. And when you add on the increasing costs of health care and health insurance, it really becomes very difficult for Warner Gear to remain a profitable enterprise.
Do you want to talk a little bit, or we'll start to get into, how, the mentality and the strength the union used to have, and its strikes and control and everything, then began to be its...
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, all right, we'll do that.
And then we'll talk about, I came close to it about BorgWarner and its meeting these new challenges and selling off lines, reacting to change.
Yeah. All right, so more on BorgWarner's reaction and
We'll start with the union kind of.
Okay, the mentality, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So when the UAW local for Warner Gear was going on these regular strikes in the 1940s and 1950s and battling for better contracts, they were essentially operating at a time of prosperity, a time when the pie was growing. And so while there was a lot of tension surrounding these strikes, and a lot of conflict that resulted from them, a lot of distrust that they produce, in the end, they're settled, and they're usually settled on terms that the workers found satisfactory and that the company could afford, could manage. But when you move forward into the age of globalization, into the 70s and especially into the 80s and 90s, it becomes harder to do that. The pie is shrinking. You can see this at Warner Gear as early as the 1970s. There's a company campaign to turn it around and turn it on, which tells you something about how they saw the way things were going at that time. And so union workers, the local workers, they were conditioned to sort of battle the company, to demand at every step of the way. When they wanted more, they had to go on strike. They had to bargain hard. They had to battle with the company to get what they wanted. And that kind of a conflict could be resolved in an era when the pie is growing, but it's pretty hard to resolve that when there's less and less to go around. And so the union's militant mentality, or the conflicts that they were accustomed to having, and the sense that they needed to really fight for everything, led them to demand things of the company that increasingly it was difficult for the company to provide. And so there was less opportunity for the company to compromise, less opportunity for the workers to get what they want, and frustrations built. And as these frustrations built, tensions built. And really the culmination of this was a conflict in 1989. Warner Gear workers go on strike in the fall of 1989 and stay out for most of the fall. And the argument is really about benefits, about health care benefits and other things. And it's a very difficult time for these workers. They're on strike for quite a while. The strike fund runs low, and the sense of frustration runs high. And finally, the union agrees to settle. They don't get everything they want by any stretch of the imagination, and as a result, they're bitter, and the company is really frustrated. And from the point of view, I think, of a lot of people within the company, this is when it becomes clear that it's going to be real hard to keep the Muncie plant going for the foreseeable future. The other thing that happens as part of the settlement of the '89 strike is that the deal that guaranteed everyone who'd worked 30 years a pension in perpetuity, forever, is undone. Before the '89 strike, the deal between the union and Warner Gear is such that when you retire after at least 30 years of work, you're guaranteed a pension and benefits for the rest of your life. After the '89 strike, the deal is such that you're not necessarily guaranteed a permanent pension and benefits. And so eventually that shift is going to come to really matter, and that's going to lead to an enormous sense of anger and betrayal on the part of the workers who feel like they had a deal in place and that they lost that arrangement.
That was perfect. Yeah. Really good job on that one. That'll lead us into, or let's just finish with that and kind of keep going with that deal that was broken, this commitment that we talked about.
Right.
You mean Warren, this. So as the identity for these workers starts to change,
right?
What is that? What was it? It was that what you just kind of talked about. So let's elaborate a little bit more on that.
Okay. Let me
maybe go back a little bit before this time.
Yeah, back to that larger sort of implied bargain, that this is the specific rejection of something that was implied. The resolution of the 1989 strike, it was in a literal sense a revision of the bargain that the union and the company had and had relied upon for the previous several decades. But it was also, in a sort of more metaphorical sense, a violation of the bargain, or set the stage for the end of the bargain. The understanding that workers have is that if we forego pay raises, or we forego some of the wages we think we're entitled to in exchange for these benefits, that these benefits will be guaranteed to us for the rest of our lives. So they trade security, or they trade wages for long-term security. And so when this starts to unravel at the end of the 20th century, and especially into the 21st century, they're furious. They feel like they've been betrayed. They feel like they struck a deal, they kept up their end of the bargain by foregoing the wages they felt they deserved, but the company hasn't. And so there's a very profound sense of betrayal. They view the company as responsible for this, but they also view the wider society in some ways is responsible for this, for pulling the rug out from underneath them after they had really helped build a community, helped build a company, and helped build a country. And so the anger is really palpable. The anger and the frustration and the sense of betrayal is quite profound.
Excellent, really good. Let's take it down a layer to how that affected the next generation. Their sons don't
Right.
really trust.
Yeah. So the children of these workers, the children of the not just Local 287, but really union workers in general, have entered into this new world where they have inherited this sense of distrust from their parents when they look at companies, when they look at the country more widely. They've inherited a lot of this suspicion, but they're operating in a world where banding together and battling isn't going to work anymore. The idea of solidarity, of holding together as a union and battling for better wages, better benefits, a better way of life, that avenue isn't open to them, or doesn't seem to be open to them in this new economy. So they're really set adrift. They've inherited a culture, they've inherited a way of understanding the world, they've inherited a set of expectations about how the world will work, that you'll have an opportunity, that if you work hard, you'll get security for the rest of your life. Yet they're coming of age and they're encountering a world that doesn't work that way. They're coming into a world where you're changing jobs all the time, where your wages are low, where you have much less leverage, much less bargaining power than your parents and your grandparents did. And so how they find their way in this world is really a question that's still up in the air. They're still trying to figure out how the world works, and I think in many ways, the whole community is, the whole country is. And so this is something that remains to be resolved. How do we make the world work now that the notion of union life is largely gone?
Great, excellent. I think we're getting a little close to, and don't be afraid. I mean, this is kind of getting close to your expertise, your opinion of this as an outside, objector. So let's move into then how BorgWarner kind of starts to change and selling off maybe the marine line and reacting to, to just kind of be survival to this globalization stuff.
Right.
Okay. Let me pull out a second here. Okay. Good.
The BorgWarner Corporation has to change in the face of globalization. From its point of view, the world is changing, the circumstances are changing, and so it's the way it operates its business has to change. And so it looks at different kinds of opportunities. Increasingly, it's setting up transmission shops to build transmissions overseas for overseas markets, and a growing slice of its profits comes from these overseas operations. The United States as a source of revenues becomes less and less significant in its overall operations. In a plant like Warner Gear, they try a variety of things. They pursue a marine line for a while. That doesn't really pan out, never becomes a big part of its sales. They switch from making transmissions to making transfer cases. And they sustain themselves for a while with that, particularly at the Warner Gear plant. It really becomes a transfer case plant in its final incarnation. But the company is always sort of changing up. It's always sort of revising its strategies in terms of how the Warner Gear plant operates. And increasingly, the Warner Gear plant becomes more expensive from them, at least from their point of view, and becomes less and less a viable part of their business. In the 1990s, one of the last product lines made at the Warner Gear plant is moved to Mexico. The final when the Warner Gear plant is finally closed off for good, the last product line moves to South Carolina, which is a non-union plant. And so the cost structures, the wage rates and benefits and so forth are considerably lower at this other plant. The Warner Gear plant is not a plant that they can afford to operate anymore.
Okay, good. Can you play that?
The '89 strike was really a turning point for both the company and the union. From the company's point of view, it was becoming clear that the arrangements at a plant like Warner Gear were not sustainable in the long run. And it was really after '89 that you can start to see the company sort of pulling away from the Warner Gear plant fairly steadily. They moved the R&D operation out, which means that no longer is Warner Gear inventing its own product lines anymore. That's being done at the headquarters. It's something that's being done elsewhere. And that gives the plant a lot less control over its own fate in many ways, as well as it gives the company less incentive to support the plant. You start to see them shifting to product lines. They sell off one of their remaining product lines to a Mexican company in the middle of the 1990s. So you can see the company withdrawing and moving away. From the point of view of the workers, it's also a turning point, the '89 strike is. It's a very difficult experience. It goes on quite a while. Things get very tight for workers, and in the end, they, perhaps even panic a little. They finally settle. They settle very quickly, and right as soon as the settlement is done, the company announces that it's laying off several hundred workers, which really didn't sit well with the rank and file. They felt like they'd been hoodwinked, and so that lingering sense of distrust that's been inherited from several generations ratchets up a little bit more, and so the union is getting a little more stubborn, a little angrier, a little bit more suspicious of the company and its motives at the same time as the company is pulling back from its commitment to the plant. And you can start to see this begin to happen. The workers also, perhaps in their haste to make this deal, give up the guarantee of retirement benefits for life. The new contract that emerges from the '89 settlement does not have that ironclad language that guarantees that any worker that retires after 30 years or more at Warner Gear will have retirement benefits for life. And so eventually that's going to play a role in how the company handles the final closure, the final decline of the Warner Gear plant. There's going to be more bargaining, and there's continued efforts through the 90s and into the early 21st century to keep the plant going. In 1901, Warner Gear celebrates its 100th anniversary from the time when Hugh Warner first put together a differential gear in his bedroom. And local officials and company officials are all very confident about the future of the company. The mayor of Muncie at the time says he can't imagine Muncie without Warner Gear, yet within just a few years, Warner Gear will be gone. And so the company is pulling back. The union is getting a little bit more stubborn and distrustful of the company's motives. And so there's a sort of a stew brewing that's going to make for a pretty unpleasant set of interactions. And this really starts to unravel beginning in 2006. At this point, the company says it wants to reopen a contract that it's just negotiated a short time before with the union. It says that the costs are too high and it needs to make some new arrangements. Union members are furious. They're frustrated, they're angry because they feel like they've just struck a deal, and this is yet another example of the company going back on its word. And so they decide, particularly the union leaders decide, not to reopen the contract. And it's right after that the company announces that it's going to close the Warner Gear plant permanently. And so that's really the final straw, is this refusal by the union. So from the company's point of view, the plant isn't sustainable under the terms of the contract. From the union's point of view, they've just signed the contract. And so now is the opportunity. And a lot of union people think that this is all maneuvering by the company to shut the thing down, or at least that's what they think after the fact, that they were being manipulated by the company so that the company could have an excuse to close the plant. In after the vote in 2006 not to open the contract, the company very quickly announces that it will close the Warner Gear plant once the current contract ends in the spring of 2009. And this sets up another set of conflict in which that union family, that union community really splits apart. Because what the company does is it poses a choice for the union. They can either take the benefits for everyone who has 30 years or more service in the company, so they would get to keep their retirement benefits, or they could take a $100,000 payout. And of course, this really splits the union. It really cleaves it, because if you have less than 30 years in at the plant, you want the cash. You get nothing if you take the benefits because you don't qualify for the benefits. On the other hand, if you're a retiree, somebody who is, or someone who's got the 30 years in and is going to retire, you will get $100,000, but you won't get that lifetime security anymore. And so for a lot of the older people, the lifetime security deal is more attractive. And so you get this split. And the last president of the local, Bill McIntosh, sides with the 30-year plus people, even though he doesn't have 30 years in. And he says, this is the deal that we've struck. We've always stuck together. And the thing that we've really worked very hard for is security for workers. And we need to hang on to that. That's more important than taking the cash. And it's really a very idealistic position. A lot of other guys in the union say, no, I'm taking the cash. I mean, this has been coming. This is the only thing I can get. I've put 20, 25 years in. And they're not offering me a watch. They're not offering me any kind of other retirement deal. They're offering me cash, and so I'm going to take that. And you sort of get this sort of very realistic faction within the group that just give me the cash, we'll walk away, it's over. And you get the more idealistic people, as well as some of the more self-interested older people who say, we want the lifetime security. And it's the fact that after the '89 strike, the deal that the union cut did not guarantee that people with more than 30 years got lifetime benefits. It's that fact that makes it possible for the union to offer this bargain and to really split for the company to offer this bargain that really splits the union, because they're not obligated, no matter what, to give people with 30 years in lifetime retirement benefits.
Real quick.
Yeah.
Just because it's such a clear point you're about to make. So we'll start over with, it was that point in the '89 contract that set it up. So
Right. Okay. So it's the reworking of the bargain at the end of the '89 strike that sets up the split in the union. It sets up the company to offer this deal to either take the cash or take the benefits, but you can't have both. That really will ultimately lead to the cleavage of the union family. Out of the '89 strike, you're no longer guaranteed, the company is no longer obligated to guarantee benefits for everyone with 30 years of service or more. And so in 2007, when the plant's closing, the company is able to say to the union, either you can take $100,000 apiece for everyone, whether you have 30 years service or not, or those of you with 30 years can have lifetime benefits, but we're not offering you both. And of course, the majority of workers left in the plant at the time, left in the union at the time, are people with less than 30 years. Only a small fraction, a smaller portion of the union rank and file have their 30 years in already. And so when there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of argument, because Bill McIntosh, who's the head of the local at this time, says that we ought to be able to we need to keep the benefits. This is the deal we struck. This is the thing that we've always been after more than anything else, which is security, lifetime security. That's the deal we struck. We do this 30 years of hard labor in exchange for a lifetime of security. And so Bill wants to stay with that traditional understanding of the union compact, of the union deal. But a lot of the other workers say, no, we want the cash. This is over. This has been ending for a while. And this is our best way to go forward. And both sides have their points. You know, if you're a 40-year-old person and the only thing you can get out of the end of your job is $100,000 in severance pay, it's either that or nothing. That's what you're going to take. But this bargain that the company presents to the union really splits the union apart. All those years of solidarity, all those years of bargaining as a unit, all those years of fighting for the whole group, that dissolves very rapidly, and there's a lot of infighting, there's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of anger as these people really, and basically what they're doing is they're arguing over what was once a shrinking pie is now just a small slice of the pie. I mean, they have this very little bit left, and they're scrambling for it and they're fighting for it, and they really have to give up the sort of the traditional understanding of the union as a tool for winning security, and that ends, not only the history of Warner Gear, but that also splits apart Local 287 permanently.
Just because you didn't totally say it, how did the vote go?
Which vote?
The 06 vote.
The vote to close the contract, or vote to not to reopen the contract, or the vote to take the cash? Okay, so
I would start with, because there was an upside down of 30 to
okay.
30.
Yeah. By the time this last vote is taken, most of the workforce left in the Warner Gear plant has less than 30 years in. Most of the people who could take retirement had taken retirement already. So the people who were voting were mostly people who had 15, 20, 25 years in the plant. And their choice was $100,000 or nothing. So it's not all that surprising that that's the way the vote went. The union leaders, Bill McIntosh in particular, argued that we really ought to stand with the bargain we've made for decades and really hold to ensuring the security and the benefits for anybody with 30 years in, but the majority vote is clearly for taking the cash. And so this is the last vote. This is what splits the union apart, and it's the last episode in this long history of both Warner Gear and of Local 287.
We didn't cover kind of like, by the time the 89 strike rolled around or whatever,
Yep.
what companies were gone? Indiana, just name all the companies that were gone.
Okay.
How many workers that used to be at BorgWarner? Now there's only...
Well, there's both before and after, because the other thing we haven't talked about is a Chevy closing.
Yeah.
And also we haven't talked about numbers, we'll get to that with Ball State. We talk about Ball State and Ball Hospital as the big employers, so we can...
Yeah, I want to make sure we cover the numbers, though.
Yeah.
The factories that have closed, the number of workers that have...
I don't know all the exact numbers for those,
Yeah,
but
we can use thousands, hundreds, or whatever, but
yeah.
by the end time, there was only, 150 BorgWarner workers
Right.
on April 24th. The year before that, there was, 700 or something around there?
Yeah.
A few hundred.
Okay. That's true. So, and this is where...
Okay, go ahead.
Globalization and deindustrialization of the Midwestern United States have been a gradual process. It's been going on in some ways since the middle of the 20th century. The first inklings that it's occurring in Muncie come in the early 1960s when the Ball Corporation decides to close its glass-making plant here in Muncie and to move it to another part of the world. And this begins a series of closings that continue on through the 1970s, 80s, 90s. Indiana Steel and Wire closed, and hundreds of jobs are lost there. Marhoffer's meatpacking plant is gone. Muncie Malleable, the foundry, disappears. And each of these closings takes with it at least hundreds of jobs. This continues on. A big Westinghouse plant on the south side of town closes in the early 1990s, and hundreds of jobs are lost there as well. And then the last piece of this process is the closing of the two big auto plants in Muncie. The first to close is the Chevrolet transmission plant, a place that had once employed 3,000 people, but was closed in 2004, and soon thereafter the entire plant was razed, and now there's a giant empty lot sitting there. And then the last final piece of this was Warner Gear, a place that employed nearly 6,000 people in the 1950s, still employed 3,000 people up into the 1970s, gradually diminished. By the middle of the 1990s, it only has about 700 workers, and by the time you get to April of 2009, it's only got about 150 workers working there when it finally closes. And it's the end of a certain era in Muncie's history. It's the end of the era of large unionized factories.
You want to, on the same tone, kind of say, the things that were left standing that are now in its places. You can talk about Ball State, Ball Memorial.
Okay.
These were lasting legacies of the
Yeah.
Balls.
Okay, I'll get into that too.
Go ahead.
Muncie's experienced really a sea change in its economic character over the last several decades. Where once it was a factory town with a dozen or more factories employing hundreds, if not thousands of people, by the time you get to the end of the 20th century and into the 21st century, the largest employers in the city are a state university, Ball State University, and a regional hospital, Ball Memorial Hospital. In fact, by the early 21st century, both Ball State and Ball Hospital employ each about 3,000 people. And that's roughly the size a couple decades earlier of roughly the number of employees employed by the two big auto parts plants in town, the Chevy plant and Warner Gear. And so there's this gradual transformation of the community from a factory town to a town that's really dominated by a university and a hospital. And there's a certain irony attached to that because both the university and the hospital are legacies of the Ball families, two of some of the lead investors in Warner Gear. And so a lot of the profits of Warner Gear were in some ways turned into a hospital and a university that are now the dominant employers and really the dominant institutions of the community. So Muncie's a much different place in the 21st century than it had been in the 20th century, and it's still trying to figure out exactly what kind of place it is.
Okay. Let's talk a little bit about, the workers and the people. I mean, this whole thing has changed. The dust has started to settle now, and we'll start to get into a little bit of Bill going to school.
Yeah, okay.
The kids, like that one Reynolds kid tried to work there for 2 years now. He's doing service jobs.
Right. Okay.
That maybe lead into it, like the identity of these Midwestern towns, and we'll go back again too and use the word Rust Belt. I'd like to use that a couple times. People have heard that. So, whenever you're ready.
Okay. Muncie's not a factory town anymore. It's really been forced to take on a new identity. In fact, both the people living here and the community as a whole have really been forced to reinvent themselves in the face of this dramatic transformation. Workers who perhaps came of age expecting that their life would be 30 years of labor on the shop floor and then a comfortable retirement after that, all of a sudden are faced with a new set of options, and it's really a bewildering set of options in many cases. They go back to school. Do they train to be some kind of medical technician? Do they go back to Ball State and get a college degree and pursue a professional job or a job as a teacher or something like that? These are all the choices that are set forth to these people who are being asked, really in middle age in many cases, to reinvent themselves, and it's an extraordinarily difficult thing. Younger people coming up who might have expected to be engaged in factory work for the majority of their lives, all of a sudden are faced with tough choices. The kinds of jobs available in Muncie are jobs at a university or a hospital that usually require a lot of education and training, or they're jobs working at a retail store that pay minimum wage or not much more than that. And it's sort of these two sets of opportunities that define the community now. So, sorry, did you?
No.
I thought you wanted.
Oh, sorry. Scratching.
The town itself is also being asked to reinvent itself. For most of its history, it's really been a factory town. Muncie was really invented to make things. And now all of a sudden in the 21st century, it's asking to reinvent itself. In many ways, it's becoming a college town, but it's not there yet. And there's a lot of people in town who don't want it to be a college town. But what kind of community it's going to be, what kind of identity it's going to have, what kind of economic character it's going to have is uncertain. And it's struggling to redefine itself in the 21st century. It's a community that will still have some manufacturing, but it won't be union manufacturing. You won't have plants that employ 3,000 people anymore. You'll have plants that employ 300 people in most cases. The wages will be decent, but they won't be nearly as good as they once were. They won't be the kinds of wages that can really lift people in and of themselves out of the middle class. And so how the community is going to adjust. Is it going to rely on its medical complex and its university to really redefine itself as a university and hospital town? Is it going to be something else? That remains to be seen. It's really a struggle for the community, and it's a process that's going to take a generation or more to do. The same is true of individuals. Where once the factory held out the opportunity for a career and a sense of security for their whole lives. Now they're faced with choices that are difficult. They can find a job right away without going back to school, working in a retail store, working in some kind of service industry, but they're going to make minimum wage or maybe a little bit more, but not much more. They're going to make really poverty wages doing that. Or they can go back to school and they can retrain themselves to become a medical technician, to become some kind of professional. But that's a very difficult thing to do if you're 45 years old and the first 4 decades of your life have all been channeled towards a factory job. And so a lot of people in the community are struggling to make that transition, just as the community itself is struggling to redefine itself.
Okay.
So.
Hold on 1 second. Kind of on that same thread we were talking about there, let's open the viewing window a little bit bigger. Talk about,
This isn't a Muncie story. This
isn't a Muncie story. This is the macro, in the Rust Belt region of Indiana, Ohio, Michigan, Pennsylvania, this area, and it's also happening in other places.
Yeah.
So that will kind of solidify.
Right.
So, and are you ready?
It's useful that Muncie is Middletown because that really points up the larger significance of this story. Yes, this is a story about one community, it's a story about one factory, it's a story about one group of workers, but it's also a much larger story. It's a process that's unfolding all across the Middle West of the United States, across the Northeast. Factories have been closing for decades now. Scholars have been studying the impact of these changes. Communities have been trying to respond to these changes. And so the Muncie story, the Middletown story, is in many ways an American story. It's a story about how broad transformations in how the world works and how the economy of the world works and how the larger culture of the world operates, how those transformations have forced a community to remake itself and forced individuals to remake themselves. So the story of Muncie is in different ways a story of other cities in Indiana like a Gary or a Kokomo. It's a story of Youngstown, Ohio. In some ways it's a story similar to the story of Detroit, writ small. It's the story of Flint, Michigan. It's the story of Braddock, Pennsylvania. There's places like this all over the Midwest, cities that came of age in the late 19th century as the nation industrialized and now are struggling to rethink themselves and remake themselves as the nation deindustrializes, or at least as this part of the nation deindustrializes. And how that story is going to end is yet to be known. It's still something that's going to be settled later.
Okay. A little something for myself, you can throw lime in there.
Okay. There's Lima, Ohio, which once had a big Ford plant that employed Justin's family, and now forces him to make a living making documentary films at a university. Yeah, so.
Let's see.
The closing of Warner Gear and the closing of a whole slew of other factories in Muncie doesn't mean that industrial production, manufacturing is no longer going to play any role in the community's economic life. You've seen the sort of remaking of manufacturing locally in the last few years. There are a couple of smaller auto parts plants that still operate locally. They're non-union plants, which means the wages aren't as strong as a BorgWarner, but that means their cost structures are in fact more competitive in a global economy. But these plants are smaller. They're going to pay a little less. They're going to employ far fewer people. You can't sustain a town on a couple of these plants. And another indication of the continuing role of industry in the community is the opening of the Bravini plant, a plant that's going to make engines or turbines for windmills as part of the coming age of green energy. And so Bravini, an Italian company, is opening a plant in the western part of Delaware County, about 7 miles from Muncie, out along the interstate. And it's going to employ about 400 people, including a number of line workers whose job will be making gears. And so in some ways, the story is coming full circle. Warner Gear got its start by making a gear, a differential gear. And now in the 21st century, the new age of the green economy and green manufacturing is going to begin locally with the making of gears, the making of large gears for wind turbines. The thing that's going to matter, though, is, again, Warner Gear employed thousands of people. Bravini is going to employ a few hundred. It'll maybe grow to a little bit larger, but it's never going to be a place that employs 5,000, 6,000 people and pays union wages. And so the work at Bravini isn't necessarily going to be a work that makes a middle class in the way that unionization made the middle class in the middle of the 20th century. So how both workers and a community adjust to that new set of circumstances is really the challenge they face going forward.
Give you a little lead in here. The story of Muncie, Indiana, and its loss from its rise in industry and to its fall has happened throughout.
Okay. With reference to Middletown, or?
Yeah, Middletown, and in America, though, too. So,
yeah.
Kind of the micro to the macro. Just
okay. When Muncie became, hold on. When Muncie became Middletown in the early 20th century, it really became an emblem of industrialization. And it's just as true today that as Muncie deindustrializes, it's an emblem of that process. It's a representative of that larger process. It's something that's happened all over the country. It's happened in Gary, Indiana. It's happened in Lima, Ohio. It's happened in Youngstown, Ohio. It's happened in Braddock, Pennsylvania. It's happened in Camden, New Jersey. If you go all across the slice of the country that industrialized in the early 20th century, all these places are deindustrializing now. And so all of these communities face the same challenge that Muncie faces, that Middletown faces, to reinvent itself in the age of a global economy.
great. That was really good. Do you have any other kind of maybe broad, and all I'm looking for here is like sound bites, kind of stuff that come to mind for you to say, this story is about, you've heard people say, this story is my father's story,
Right.
this story, stuff like that. Anything come to mind? I'm trying to think of the story of these unions.
Yeah.
Is a story of, the climb and growth of labor
Mm-hmm.
through the industrial age in America, and it's unique to America,
Okay. The Muncie story and the Warner Gear story and the local 287 story are really American stories in a variety of ways. It's a story of innovation and entrepreneurship that built a company. It's a story of a community that rose up around a handful of manufacturing operations. It's a story of workers that fought for more security and more material comfort in their lives. But in the end, it's also a story about how all the arrangements that made all of those things possible unravel. And it becomes a story of how both a people and a community reinvent themselves in the face of these new circumstances.
That's good. I like that. Let's go with one on a different theme, kind of an ending thing. This story, this ending story is kind of unique to Muncie, so kind of the reverse of what you just said.
Just as Muncie served as Middletown as a representative industrial American community at the beginning of the 20th century, it can serve as a Middletown for the 21st century, a place where deindustrialization has taken place. People in Muncie made their way in the world by making things, and now in the 21st century, they're going to have to make something new. They're going to have to make new lives for themselves in the face of a much different economy, in the face of a much different society. And that story is true not just of workers from Muncie, it's true of workers and of citizens all over the United States, particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast, places that have been dramatically transformed by globalization and deindustrialization.